Today's guest on Wicked Problems is Martin Walsh from Think Above Cloud. In the noughties, Martin cut his teeth as an early AWS pioneer, leading two of the largest migrations in the world at that time. He now has 15 years' experience in digital strategy, cloud architecture, and digital operating models, and has provided best practice cloud usage, DevOps, Agile operating models, and technical leadership to some of the world's largest companies. Before we start, a quick disclaimer. Martin and I have worked together in the past, so this episode of Wicked Problems may feel a little less formal than previous ones. Don't be put off. As you'll hear, both Martin and I share the view that digitalisation is going to be an important aspect of economic recovery post-Covid-19. As ever, enjoy the show. Martin, welcome to Wicked Problems. It's great to have you on the show.
Afternoon, Toby.
Digitalisation, I think it's it's for everything, all the signs I'm seeing coming out of COVID-19, we're going to have to accelerate digitalisation, particularly in financial services. And I think it's a wicked problem for a lot of people because it's not something that's been addressed that much in markets. People have been able to cobble together, sticky tape and glue over lots of legacy solutions. But real digitalisation, I think, is you can see there's lots of omens portraying that's where we're going to need to go. And so it is a wicked problem for a lot of people who maybe haven't been exposed to that, are in leadership positions, and really need to think about how do we do it properly, not this sort of 5-year grandiose project, but actually we need to accelerate our digitalisation. And I think you guys at Think Above Cloud, Martin, you yourself have got the sort of maturity flower, I think you call it. And maybe we could spend some time unpacking that. Would be a great start.
Yeah. Okay. Again, thanks again. I think you're absolutely right, and I think one of the challenges is, we've both been around IT a long time now. 20 years plus. We've come through from mainframe and mid ranges through client server x86 all the way to today. There has never been a bigger sea change in the way IT functions should operate with the business than a true digital transformation and what enables a digital transformation. Okay, it is so all-encompassing in how you operate. It is, as you say, there's a lack of experience in senior leadership positions and within traditional IT functions, and it's simply too daunting. And what you tend to see is parts of what need to be done possibly implemented. I think we've already gone through it a bit with Agile. I think Agile's had 10 to 15 years of the same issues of not being fully understood, not being properly implemented, and tried to be wedged in and fitted to an existing operating model. And I think Agile is one of 5 parts we talk about in the flower that you kindly mentioned. We talk about cloud platforms, Amazon, Google, Azure. We talk about cloud native applications. We write applications in a different way today. We manage that in an agile fashion. We use DevOps, an SRE, new ways of working to deliver software and write and build software. And we also talk about the organizational structure, because the organizational structure is different. Now, if big enterprises have struggled in the past with simply adopting Agile and doing Agile properly and misunderstanding that, and effectively, we all laugh about it, but move into that Wagile model where it's not truly Agile. They might use a board, they might use Jira. I think we've all seen that that meme going around, just because you use Jira or you use Kanban, you're not Agile. We've seen a lot of that historically. You're then expecting them to take on another 4 facets and implement and do them. And you are fighting against human nature of resistance to change, lack of understanding, protectionism. You're fighting against metrics and measurements for staff and bonus schemes and incentives that just don't match this world and often compete with each other. And you're also fighting against 20 years of doing things one way.
So just in case, for anyone who's listening or watching who may maybe isn't familiar with the term Wagile, I think that's by that I think you mean a sort of waterfall adaptation of Agile. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Where you may, at the coal face down at the bottom, you're trying to break your work down into smaller chunks, but ultimately you're still delivering it in a very traditional waterfall fashion. And there's a lot of bashing of waterfall, and I think it's very important. There's a lot of things I'll talk about where it sounds like I'm being very derisory about them, and I'm not being derisory about them. They have a place and a purpose. Okay, now for some of them, that place and the purpose just no longer exists, and you have to be honest about that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with waterfall when you are doing something that you know and understand. I always say waterfall is for the known, a printer rollout. An Office 365 migration, perhaps. It's repeatable. It's like building like Tesco's, their lean methodology, when they go in and build a supermarket. They know exactly what they're doing. They know the kind of things that are going to stop them, and they can run it as a waterfall Gantt chart type project and deliver that because it's known. They've seen all variations of that. And for me, Agile and DevOps and this new way of working is for the unknown. And let's be brutally honest, writing software is unknown.
So actually, in the terms of problem definition, really waterfall is kind of for tame problems and Agile is for wicked problems, because you don't know where you're going to go with a wicked problem.
Yeah,
or what the output's going to be.
Yeah, absolutely right. I couldn't agree more with that. I think we've all seen, and it's a great example of, requirements gathering at the start of projects, particularly around software. It's that requirements gathering. You're asking people for requirements when they know the least about the system they're going to build and use. And a lot of the time, the best feedback you get around requirements and what users want would be halfway through. Now, of course, in a traditional waterfall world, that terrifies your traditional PM because it's scope creep. And as soon as you get into scope creep, it's money, it's time, etc., and there's a full-blown panic. Additionally, you can always you end up writing, and I won't wax lyrical here about the numbers. You can Google that. Your listeners can Google it for themselves. But lots and lots of numbers about the amount of features designed in software that very few, if anybody, ever uses. And we used to use an old analogy of, if you give somebody a bucket of sweets, they're going to sit there and eat a bucket of sweets till they stop because they asked you for a bucket of sweets. If you put the sweets in a long line and an empty bucket at the end, they'll stop after a third of the way because they've had enough. And it's very simplistic, but it's true. When you start building things, feature by feature, functionality by functionality, and start prioritizing stuff as you go, it's amazing the amount of early features that people think they needed will drop out and disappear. And it's that constant. I know you're a fan of Moscow, as am I, but Moscow needs to iterate every sprint.
And it has to be used properly. One of the problems I've found when people use Moscow is that everything becomes a must-have.
Of course it does.
Which means
absolutely.
That nothing is.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, absolutely right. So that constant iteration of Moscow for this phase, breaking it down into smaller chunks. What do you need first? Let's try and plan this out. And you end up saving yourself a lot of time. And this is provable. And, you'll get your naysayer who said, we've done Agile, it didn't work. Well, you didn't do Agile properly. And that may not be your fault. You may not have understood it. You may not have had buy-in from senior management. You may not have had buy-in from your PMO office. You may not have buy-in from your manager who still likes to see a classic RAG status type report, but you've not done it right. And that purports straight across to DevOps. It's exactly the same. And these new ways of working. You've got to understand it. You've got to do it properly. You've got to have sponsorship from above, and you've got to understand how it permeates into every aspect of how you deliver IT, finance, HR, everything.
And I think that's really key, actually, that it's not just about writing code and delivering code. It actually impacts across the organization, and it becomes a sort of cultural, organizational change piece, as well as a technology piece. And I'm very fond of the saying that the technology is the easy bit. And I don't mean to say that technologists don't do difficult work. What I'm saying is I can go and get an expert who understands how to write code for me, and they can write that code. And I might have to change my spec as we go along because I'm using Agile. But actually the cultural change is way, way bigger. And that's where we come at with Agile. And I've seen, you brought up, people might not have done it right. And I have to say, I've seen in many places where someone's just given a tool, maybe it's Jira, maybe it's something similar, and they're told, right, go and figure Agile out using that. And they come back with all sorts of interesting and really quite inventive ways of using it. Like I've seen people using 3 different boards for the same thing, but they're looking at it in different views, so they've created different boards. And the reason is because, as you say, they've not been taught how to do it. And so, yes, Agile, it really does require, I think you're right, it really does require that training, that understanding, that knowledge. You also mentioned DevOps, and I just wondered if we could segue into DevOps for a while, because again, in a lot of banks and exchanges and some fintech firms even that I've worked at, it's a very, if I ask everybody in all those firms, I'll get as many different answers as people I ask. What the hell is DevOps? Maybe you can elaborate.
Well, yeah, and 10 years ago, we used to get the same question about cloud. We used to have that often, public cloud versus VMware debate. What is a cloud? What isn't a cloud? And so, yeah, DevOps is an interesting one. I think it's been one of the biggest single enablers I've seen, and probably the most misunderstood. I think that's a fair assessment. And like you, I'm very fond of the saying, look, the tech's the easy bit here. The difficult bit is going to be to change the way you work as an organization, from across all these different, different parts of the business, finance, HR, et cetera, project delivery. So DevOps in of itself. So DevOps started just over a decade ago now, with a group of people. There's a set who came together trying to break down the walls between development and operations. We all know that classic model. Okay, developers write code, they give it to operations to install into prod. It doesn't work. It's a back and forth argument of accountability, which actually ends up being a blame game. It's not true accountability, which should be a proactive process. And the successful change rate of major changes in production of most major systems is what has been traditionally absolutely appalling. And that world had to change. So there's different ways to change that. Technology certainly helped. The advent of cloud computing and the levels of automation we can do, the levels of tools that support that automation. All these things are great enablers. But ultimately, what DevOps was about, and if anybody wants to read about it, I advocate very greatly the Phoenix Project, which most people in our industry have read now. But then move on to the Devops Handbook, which is it can be a bit dry in places, but that's the evidence of the Phoenix Project we've talked about it as a story format. Phoenix Project is a very easy read, very lightweight read, set around a story of an IT company, and anyone who's worked in or around IT will recognize a lot of things in it and find it very amusing. Devops Handbook starts to actually go into the detail of that, of what DevOps is and how DevOps works. And then there's a follow-up book called Accelerate, which actually looks post-DevOps Handbook at a 2-year study of the industry to say, yeah, look, we were right. Right, this is a better way of working. Here are the companies that do it properly. Here's how better they are at this than you are.
So in a sense, it's like a peer review almost,
Yeah, absolutely. And it's hard empirical evidence that can't be argued with, right? And this shows you where we are with DevOps. It's been around a long time now. So you've got a book that explains it in a story format, a book that explains it and gives you good examples, then a book that does then a big meta report of various reports and what they've seen in the industry as well to pull it all together to prove the case, and that's been a 5-year, 6-year process. So going back to the original question, in a nutshell, what is it? I mean, when you actually break it down and get rid of the rubbish, DevOps is about, they call it the 3 ways, right? And it's just 3 principles of the way you work. So it's not a framework, it's not a noun, it's not a team, it's just a way of working. And the first way, and it can sound airy-fairy. I think you and me have sat in a meeting with a client and talked about this. And I've said, this can be airy-fairy, but there is detail behind this and there's technology behind it. The first way is work always flows in one direction. So work should always go, as they talked about in the old days, from dev to ops. It should only go that way because you've thoroughly tested it. It works. It's defect-free. It's bug-free. Now, of course, these are all ideals, right? The second way is about what they call creating and shortening and amplifying feedback loops. Okay, so making that process smaller and shorter. And ultimately, the way you do that is you break the work you are passing through, you break down into much, much smaller chunks. And this is something people have heard a lot about DevOps, who people who even have a vague understanding, is that, I'm doing releases every day or every 2 minutes rather than quarterly. Of course, that's the other end of the spectrum to quarterly releases. The reality is somewhere in the middle. But the idea is you are releasing smaller chunks of things at a time. All of a sudden, when you think about that, you understand how that can tie into Agile. Okay, you see the synergy. Many times I've been asked by people, DevOps and Agile are mutually exclusive. They're two different frameworks. And it's like, one's not a framework, one's a set of principles. The other one is a framework, a set of principles, and a MO, right? They actually work hand in glove together for that reason. And then the third way is about continued experimentation, learning from your mistakes, not being afraid to fail, and they call it achieving mastery, just becoming so good at what you do because you do it so often, so quickly, so frequently, that it becomes second nature, unlike that big, slow build up to that quarterly release. So that's in essence what DevOps is. Okay? Doesn't talk about team structures, doesn't talk about skills, doesn't talk about technology. It's just that.
So it's a kind of, I suppose it's an ethos instead of a process.
Absolutely, yeah.
Been laid down. It's a set of principles almost.
It is. It's called the 3 ways, a set of principles. That's how it's. That's.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, that's what it is. The three ways. And if you read the Phoenix Project, they have some sort of semi-guru type Jesus figure who drifts in and out, trying to steer our main protagonist towards what the 3 ways are, trying to get them to learn them for themselves. It's quite funny the way it's done, but ultimately that's what they are. And again, if you just look at them in isolation, you think, okay, workflows in one direction, great, yeah, it should do. We do stuff smaller, we get better feedback, great, and we experiment and we learn from our mistakes, great.
Okay. It almost sounds a little bit like a digital representation of Agile at some level.
Well, this is the thing. I've struggled. I understand many people's questions, misgivings, and misunderstandings of things, but I've always struggled to understand how people don't see that DevOps and Agile literally like that. Absolutely hand in hand.
And we talked about DevOps. We've got Agile. Your Flower of Maturity talks about. There's 3 other parts there, one of which is cloud, right? And in the model that I've seen, it talks about specifically about public cloud as opposed to, say, private cloud.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to draw on that. So is the suggestion there that actually public clouds are more mature than private clouds, or perhaps you help me sort of unpack that?
More feature rich,
right?
More feature rich. I'm not on here. I back in the day worked on some very large VMware projects, did a lot of VMware, and then was fortunate enough to get into cloud early. And I'm certainly not going to bash VMware here. It's the best product in the world at what it does. It's very good at it. Does it compete with a public cloud in terms of feature set? No, absolutely not. And VMware have taken an interesting tactic over the last few years to work with, to offer VMware effectively on top of and use their tools on top of cloud. My main problem with VMware, it's not even VMware, but it's the way a traditional VMware installation within a traditional data center works, is you still have there was a lack of, and VMware is improving here, let's not get me wrong, but the level of automation compared to a public cloud, it wasn't close. Okay, I could build out an environment in public cloud, and even using the public cloud tools, create a template to rebuild that in a matter of minutes. And with private cloud solutions, that wasn't so much the case. And I also appreciate I'm talking about just VMware here and not Pivot, not Cloud Foundry Pivotal type solutions. But and that level of automation wasn't there. Additionally, because it was wrapped within a traditional IT function, it was traditional IT operating model. As a developer, I had to put a request in, get a ticket. Someone had to build me infrastructure. And the whole point of cloud is it's a self-service platform. Okay, and it's a self-service platform that we can wrap all the governance controls we need around, where users get, the guys doing stuff can bring up what they need when they need it. And that was the intrinsic difference here. This is the part of the DevOps piece, the flower, as you say, is changing that operating model. IT becomes a provider of self-service platforms, just like the cloud provider is. Now, IT might wrap those public cloud services up themselves and have some governance control, great, but ultimately they still need to be self-service.
I think it also gives sort of brings up an interesting question, which is, and I've noticed this in a number of companies, that people think, right, well, we're going to go to the cloud, so let's have a discussion about private or public. Okay, we're going to go to public cloud, let's say.
Yep.
And then they say, well, that means we've got to be either AWS, GCP, Azure, and then they go and commit themselves to big procurement contracts in the same way that they did when they were buying, let's say, a mainframe system or a mini system or whatever it was. And that doesn't seem to me to be optimal, given that, if my computer is out there on the cloud and or my service or whatever it is, surely can I consume from multiple clouds? And is that a better strategy than from one, or does it not matter? Or
don't let procurement teams choose your cloud platform. Okay,
that's pretty unequivocal.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not here to bash any particular provider. They all have their strengths, and I work with all three. I've done 3 very large projects last year with all 3 main providers: Google, Amazon, and Azure. I have an issue with procurement teams going out and saying we're going to use Azure because we have an existing EULA, we can tie it into our EULA and the procurement model works and we can do it like this, this and this. Well, you've just tied me into Azure and I don't want to use Azure for this, that and the other. Likewise, I wouldn't want someone to tie me in solely to Google because there's things I'd want to use elsewhere. And likewise, my history has been Amazon. That was the first cloud I used. I also love the others for different reasons. I wouldn't want to be tied in solely to Amazon because there's things Google does better, for example. So absolutely use different things. I think there's an understanding in the market now that people know, Google has a reputation for analytics. It has a good reputation for its container, Docker, its Kubernetes platform. Amazon has a very good reputation for its breadth of services, generally first to market, all that kind of stuff. So they all have their horses for courses, all have their swings and roundabouts. You're not going to get massive enormous discounts out of Amazon and Google. They'll do Amazon and Google, they'll do certain programs with you, but ultimately, you're not going to get big bargains. Microsoft are a different creature. They have Office 365 they can leverage against, they can offer good deals, but you're absolutely right. Don't tie yourself to one horse, right? There are strengths in all of them. Your technical teams now have matured to the level where my engineers or my principal associates and my principal engineers, those guys are experienced and working on minimum 2 clouds, if not all 3, and actually can use all of them absolutely fine to the same level of expertise. They don't care. They'd rather use the best tool for the job. Now, flip side of that coin, and I may be preempting your next question, is you don't want the Wild West. Okay, there needs to be a level of control. So there still needs to be some guidance and guide rails from the top, perhaps, that says, look, we like this for analytics. This is where we're going to store all of our analytical data. We're going to go with Google for analytics. We're going to use Amazon for this, 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 and this, and we're going to use Azure for this, 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 and this. I think that's fine. And unless you have a compelling reason to break that, then I don't have a problem with those levels of guidelines.
Right. So the takeaway from that is that there's, all of these platforms have their strengths.
Yep.
And for something to have a strength, it must have a weakness.
Yep.
I suppose not must have, but there's an implied weakness somewhere across the platform if one's stronger than the other. And therefore, what you have got is the capability to cherry pick the strengths and then put the governance model around those so that you're not introducing any sort of Wild West behaviours, as you said.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can't put yourself in a box where one of the providers comes out of the solution first. It's going to be 6 months before the others bring out a service of a relevant maturity, and you then can't use that service for 6 months. Would possibly in one of your areas give you a massive advantage over your competitors if you were to do so. Okay, and you just sit there going, well, no, we're going to have to wait for cloud provider X because we can't use that platform. The whole point of this the whole point of DevOps, the whole point of Agile, the whole point of this digital world is to be able to innovate incredibly quickly, deliver value fast. And those big traditional procurement deals simply don't, they don't match. Yeah, exactly. They don't match that goal.
And another point on the flower is cloud native, right? So again, worth having a little explore on what that means, because it will mean different things to different people, I suspect.
Yeah, so we're looking to build our applications in a different way. We're looking to use, there is the CNCF, who are the cloud native organization body that will tell you what a cloud native application should look like, and they give good examples, exemplars as they call them. Some people's mistake is they read that list of exemplars and think they need to do all of them to be cloud native. The important line at the end of the CNCF statement on what cloud native is these are exemplars. That doesn't mean you need all of them. So you can get in many arguments with people about, well, actually it is cloud native, but why have you picked that technology? You didn't need to. Oh, we needed to be cloud native, like it's some sort of badge of honor or some accreditation. Cloud native applications are effectively clouds that are built to run on and take advantage of cloud platforms.
Right.
It really is that simple. And what I mean by take advantage of, they have the ability to scale up and down on demand, on a pay-per-use model. They are built to expect failures of componentry and be able to survive failure. Services tend to be broken. The application tends to be broken out into discrete services that, in many ways, are separate from each other. You can almost see each one as its own application, and can be developed by teams in isolation from the rest. Although obviously they'd get requirements into what they need to do. So I always try and keep this simple, because you can go into the tech, and the tech's largely unimportant here. Designing applications that get the best use out of cloud and what benefits cloud brings, and that is automation, scalability, and speed, right?
Right. Okay. And can you, if you build cloud native, you could, do you have to deploy that to cloud, or is to public cloud, or you could maybe do it to private cloud? Or
you can do it on private cloud. So there's plenty of you've got the likes of Pivotal out there. My own experience is it can get quite expensive, but I'm sure there'd be plenty of Pivotal guys who'd argue that public cloud is always cheaper than a badly implemented private cloud. I think it's probably the best way to say it. VMware improving all the time. I used to do a lot of work with OpenStack, and that had a lot of promise, and there's still a few telcos running that, and that kind of got marketed to death by VMware, unfortunately. But there was some hope there. But no, you do it on private cloud, particularly around Google themselves now released their container platform for you to run in private cloud. But Amazon, for example, have 167 services, or where they have. How many of those services are available in a private cloud in your own data center? And that's ultimately what it comes down to, is that breadth of services. Also, and I think this is a important point, is there was a big drive about 5 years ago now about making applications mobile and portable, so you could run them in any cloud provider, and that became a bit of a busted flush, because what the cloud providers then started doing was releasing excellent own brand native services, their own version of this, their own version of that. And if you followed that model, you inhibit yourself from using them. You isolate yourself. I can't use these services. So you got stuck trying to buy products that work across all three. And again, that was a grave mistake as well. If you speak to a lot of DevOps guys and girls who are on the coalface working, and actually some of the material around this, and some of the experts will say, the engineering teams that are building these products, the utopian vision is you should allow them to use whatever they want to use, because they're the best judge of what the best tool is. Okay. And a lot of my senior guys that and love would argue that case, and I would actually argue a middle ground of guidance and guidelines and guide rails and controls, but ultimately, yes, giving people as much choice as possible to do their job as quickly as they can.
I suppose it's a bit like giving the woodworker, well, I'd like you to use this particular wood, but I'm not going to tell you which plane and which saw and which, any of the other tools that you should be using, because you're the best guide on that. Yeah,
it needs. Yeah, I want two drawers, 4 legs. It needs to be this height, and I like that wood because that's the look I like. How you do it is an irrelevance to me. Yeah.
another part of the flower is the operating model, and I think this is quite an interesting one because it's very easy for people to think, well, surely that's in DevOps, right? Because it's got the word operating model and it starts with O and P, and it's I think it's a very understandable mistake to make if you're new to all of this, right? But it's not actually the right way of thinking about it, right?
No, absolutely not. As I said, DevOps is the three airy fairy principles I gave you earlier. There is a whole piece of them. What does that look like as an operating model? Now, the literature, particularly Devops Handbook, will start to talk about operating model and how you should structure engineering, and and by engineering I include development, by the way. How you should structure that, and there's a great diagram in there that talks about the cost optimized IT world versus the market product optimized IT world. And what we have in the traditional world, as you know, is the silos of expertise, and that was always done for cost. Okay, it's I'll get my best bang for my buck if I put all my DBAs in one team, and work comes into them through a ticketing system, and they can constantly be working. There's no downtime for them, etc. And partly built on that sort of Taylorism methodology, wasn't it, of the production line. I'd need people just to know this bit, and they're part of that production line. What we know happened in that is ticketing systems became a black hole of death for any IT project, particularly someone like yourself, Toby, who's more on the sort of delivery side and project side than myself on the doing side. You'd see that how much time, and we've got a great mutual friend and someone we've worked in the past, James Enoch, great Agile guy and flow guy, who will talk to you about the amount of, and he'll turn it into millions of pounds. How many millions of your 20 million project was spent waiting, right? And how much of that is sat in a ticketing queue? So that
delay costs.
Absolutely, yeah. And that became the classic issue with the old world, is a ticketing system effectively became a place to hide, and stuff got bounced around. And there's a great model there that shows a ticket going all over the place between the teams to get done. And then move into the modern world where you're delivering self-service platforms for your engineering function to utilize. They're utilizing it directly, and you're breaking those teams down into small teams. Small teams deliver. This is something we've been talking about for a decade now. The Amazon thing, the 2 pizza teams. If a team's too big for 2 pizzas to feed doing overtime, the team's too big, right? It's and there's plenty of studies, and I'm sure you've seen them, about communication effectiveness once teams get above 8 or 10 people. It starts as exponential waste of time on communication. So it's all about breaking your teams down small, which again lends itself to cloud native applications, because you break our applications down smaller into smaller chunks. It works with Agile because we're breaking work down into smaller chunks, which you can tie against these smaller things. And it's all about having self-empowered, multi-skilled small teams to deliver stuff. And we've seen it time and time again. When do you ever get a skunk works project from the boss, a JFDI, and you pull together 6 people to go and do it? You fly through it. Absolutely. Yeah. You smash it out the door. Everyone knows what they're doing. Small team, everyone's communicating, you get it done. It's about taking that and expanding that and moving that across. How do you do that in an enterprise? Well, you have 50 of those teams. Well, how do I manage it? Well, that's where a PO becomes involved. You and me will go in and teach you exactly how to manage it and how to scale it. But that's the fear. And that's where you come across such massive resistance. You and me have been involved in a project where we absolutely 1000% proved the tech and proved the process. Did we not? Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. We took a problem, a traditional problem that a lot of people see, 6 months to build a test in dev environment, a production environment, X $1 million. And we turned that around, and within 3 weeks we were able to build an environment in 17 minutes, and the run cost was, percentages of $1 million, right?
It was hundreds of dollars.
Yeah, hundreds of dollars. But the issue is you then, and you see this a lot, and I've seen this in a lot of banks, and people who work in banks will recognize this. Someone comes in who understands this world, takes a project and sets it up to work like that, and they deliver. What they then don't do is amplify that and amplify that and amplify that, and put in the kind of governance, control and operating model management that needs to thrive and move across the business. They take that and try and bring it back into the big corporate machine, and it just gets ground up in the cogs. It starts to fail.
I have a theory, and it's only my theory, so I'll run it past you anyway. right? And that is that there's a lacuna in leadership, and that lacuna is around people being, we put people into leadership positions and then we don't tell them what that means. So they struggle with that anyway sometimes. And you end up ultimately with the Peter Principle coming into effect. Park that for a moment, because let's assume that you've got competent people in management, which I think generally, by and large, we do. But we don't tell them, here's this new thing. It's called Agile, or it's called Devops, or it's called Cloud. We don't tell them actually how that's going to impact their day-to-day relationships across the business, how it's going to affect the processes for them to do their day-to-day job. So we talked earlier about procurement cycles and HR cycles and finance cycles and all sorts of aspects of the business that need to change to support all of this digitalisation. And then we often turn around and go, are they stupid? They don't seem to understand what's going on. Well, they're not stupid. They just haven't been given the information. And it's a bit like saying, here's a rocket that's going to take you to the moon. What? You failed to lift off. Are you stupid? Well, they didn't know which buttons to press, and they didn't know so many things they didn't understand.
Yeah, they know what the rocket's supposed to do.
Yeah.
Absolutely, but how to operate it. I couldn't agree more. I think there is a gap there, absolutely. And not only teaching and explaining and getting people to understand, but then experience of doing it and understanding what happens when you go through that process and the kind of problems that will occur. I think not only is there a lacuna in management, and I won't use this to try and pitch myself at all, but that's what we've tried to resolve, is fill that gap, to offer experience of doing it, hands-on, but feet on the ground doing it. I think there's been a gap between the Big Four approach, and I don't knock the Big Four, they're the Big Four for a reason, right? But the Big Four approach of going in and selling a massive framework and a massive transformation program, then trying to implement that. And the more niche consultancy, of which we're one of, with most of the consultancies, we all know each other, right? We're all peers of each other. Going in and doing a product, a shadow IT project on its own and delivering that product. And there's this big gap in the middle of, right, okay, actually I'm an advocate of the small product, that small shadow IT project, and proving out it works. But you grow from that. You don't use that to prove it and then go and hit that big transformation model. The big end goal should always be in mind, okay? But every company is going to be slightly different. And we've talked about this in the past. I'm going to do DevOps and I'm going to do SRE. SRE is another thing we can talk about, right? So we won't go into it here, but I'm going to do that, and this is why I'm going to do it, and this is how I'm going to lay it out. Well, different applications will work in different ways, different types of organizational structures. Do a team do the support as well as, they push it all the way to prod, but are they doing 24/7 out of our support for this application? What's your risk profile for that application? Do you actually still need an ops team sitting there doing that kind of comfort because 90% of your customers use it and 80% of your revenue goes through it? And actually, that incredible world where we hear about, WhatsApp getting bought by, one of the big guys, and they only had 5 engineers, or Instagram had 3 engineers, and all these kind of crazy things. That's not the real world of a financial services application that you're managing all your funds through, for example, or is doing all your brokerage. It's just not that simple. And actually, you need to build that out. You need to understand how the existing IT function works, how to take that on a journey, but how to grow that second piece. You had to grow that out. And I think you're absolutely right. Experience of doing that. So people fall on their traditional, what they know. I'll throw a load of money at a big firm and they'll give me a plan and we'll go and do that plan. But there's no thought. You've got to be at both ends of that.
I just wanted to ask one more question and then we'll wind it up. But it's a really important question, I think, which is I think it's implicit in everything that's on the flower, really. It's a security, right? And there is a feeling, I think, amongst people who are new to cloud that somehow it's the Wild West. You mentioned that phrase earlier, that it's not secure, that, if and I think about financial services where you've got client confidential information is, everyone's confidential information should be confidential. It doesn't really matter if it's financial or not, but people naturally are more spooked by, when it's a fund that's worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and for very good reasons, the client doesn't want that revealed to the world. And it's really, I know some people might think that's because they're trying to hide their tax position. It's not really, is it? It's because they don't want to be the victim of someone coming along and trying to hold them to ransom, or something else, or the target of fraud, or the target of
purely a reputation.
Or reputation, exactly.
Absolutely, yeah. You lose two big clients, and we know a lot of the way these investment banks work. Some of their huge clients are a large chunk of revenue, and you lose reputation, you lose one of those. It's a challenge. So people are terrified of security, and security is an interesting one. I take quite a modern view to security, I hope. And you know very well my good friend, guy I work with a lot, Toby from Secure Delivery. And they very much have an ethos which I agree with, and we've implemented ourselves of, security is just another requirement. It needs to be taken, it needs to be respected and understood 100%, but it needs to be taken out this ivory tower. Security is one of the biggest challenges to cloud, which is odd because from a technical point of view, it's one of the easiest to solve.
Because it's infrastructure as code, and you can just roll it out again and again and again in an immutable fashion.
With absolutely tight version control, and because we're doing smaller changes, rolling back and rolling forward is easy. We have levels of visibility now and optics on stuff that we've never had in the past. So we've often given a little talk where we say why your CSO is killing your business, and actually it's not the CSO we're having a go at. The CSO is operating and being given a set of guidelines. He's operating the way he has to operate, and he's operating in a legacy world. And we're saying, look, there is a new way of doing security. It is just a requirement like the others. We can automate it to death. Okay. And this comes about the second way: create, short, and amplify feedback loops. One of those is, as we're going through the process, we're testing all the way. All the way. And read the Devops Handbook. Plenty of stuff in there about companies, great examples of companies. Etsy's one, who started from nothing and then got up to 14,000 automated tests that they're running in an hour or something like that. And you are constantly testing and testing. Learn from your mistakes. Oh, we found something. It's got through. Right. How do we mitigate it? What do we need to write? How do we make sure it never happens again? Automate. So security, yeah. I always say to people when we start on this journey, and I think I said it to you, Toby, in the past when we worked together, our challenges will be security, our challenges will be finance, our challenges will be HR, which surprises everybody. We're not technical? No, not really. We'll prove the tech. These are, and they are battles, unfortunately, within organizations. Security is the one that is easiest to solve. It is provable. And you've seen us prove it in the past, the level of automated testing you can do. And if you get a positive CSO or a good advocate within the security team who gets this new world, it's a very powerful way to accelerate that. You have to involve security from the start, bring them on this journey. You'll often find they're very keen to do it. They're just hamstrung by the way they currently work. They're not fans of posthumously having to apply security to something that's already been written. It doesn't really work. The cost of it exponentially versus doing it at the start. They don't like being the bogeyman. Okay, get them involved early, get them involved at the start, get them to this newer way of working, and security can end up being actually one of your biggest selling points if you pitch it right.
Martin, that has been absolutely, we could go on and on and on because it's such a fascinating and rich subject. This whole, digitalization. And I think I'm going to ask you one question in closing, which is just to say, how important do you think this digitalization world, Agile, Devops, SRE, it's cloud in terms of public cloud, cloud native, and so on. How important do you think that is going to be in helping us get back on our feet post-COVID-19 and be able to, change our ways of working?
I think it's the single biggest enabler to that. Okay. The other, we could talk about culture another time. Culture is always a thing, but in terms of what we talk about on the maturity flower, it's the biggest single enabler to that. The whole MO, the whole reason for these things existing is pace and agility. And what I'd like to close on with DevOps, and it's something I say a lot of people don't understand, DevOps is not about working at greater speed. Because when you talk about working at greater speed, people get quite rightly frightened. Speed, there's time, cost, effort. There's got to be something about going faster. What DevOps allows you to do is run at speed in a safe fashion.
That's a very good point to leave the discussion on, I think. Martin Walsh, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Toby. A pleasure.